This is a production of WKNO Memphis. Production funding for this program is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Dan Conaway writes a weekly column called Memphasis, published in the Memphis Daily News and the Memphis News, and posted on his website. It was named one of the top 4 personal columns in Tennessee by the Tennessee Press Association in their 2010 competition. Recently, he put together a book based on his columns and posts on his website. The book is called I'm a Memphian. And what kind of man is Dan Conaway? As Nora, his wife of 42 years, and his grown children Hallie and Gaines say, he is often wrong, but never in doubt. Thank you for being on the program, Dan.
Thank you, Pierre. My pleasure to be here.
You know, we were talking about writing a column and some of the pressures. I had and we were talking before, you know, I had a friend who called me the other day. He forgot that he had a column due, and he went into a total panic, didn't have an idea in his head. I often think that kind of pressure is just incredible to endure, you know, for the average columnist. Have you been through that where you just said to yourself, gosh, I just don't have an idea in my head this week?
Sure. I mean, of course, everybody who writes for a living in any capacity is familiar with deadlines, so they're kind of used to the pressure of that concept. But if you're writing a column, you really don't ever want to phone it in. I mean, you know, you want somebody to want to read it, and you want them to anticipate getting something out of it and looking forward to it. And you know, if you just kind of throw it together, that's not going to be the case. You're not going to be doing it long. So not only do you want to come up with something, a good idea, if you will, you want to feel like it's good yourself.
Right.
And sometimes when it's Tuesday and the deadline is that afternoon and you haven't written anything that morning, that's daunting. And you have to come up with something. So, you know, you keep coming. And as you and I were talking before this, I didn't have a column for next week until shortly after you left the room and came back. I came up with something, and now I like it, so it's running around in my head, and as soon as we finish here, it's going to go to a piece of paper pretty soon.
Wow.
So,
yeah, that's, well, the monster has to be fed.
yeah, the monster does have to be fed.
Yeah, well, now your very first column, it was done 4 years ago, right?
Just about.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about that column.
Well, it's I wanted to tell potential readers why I thought I might write a column and why somebody else thought that might be a pretty good idea and took a chance on my doing it, because I feel like Memphis has so many wonderful stories, and Memphians are all aware of that, but we don't tell that story well to others. And while we are privately one of the warmest places on earth and get along with everybody about everything, publicly we don't appear to be doing that. And we are not as proud of ourselves as we should be, and not as honest with ourselves as we should be about both our positive points and our negative points and how that solution is at hand. I kind of wanted to state some of that in the first column and talk about just how funky a town this is and how wonderful it is to be that we have a personality, and there's so many cities, so many places that have no personality at all and are longing for what we have in great abundance, and we're not aware of that, or if we are aware of it, we're in denial about it. And that makes it a pretty interesting place to live, and that's kind of what I want to write about, both the past of it and the potential future of it. You know, I've said before that, you know, with the situation we have here, with the makeup of our population, the diversity here, the abject poverty and the richness and the creativity and the music and all of that, if we can address and solve our problems in this city, we can be a model for every other city everywhere. And I think Memphis needs to realize that and start to try and do that.
You have a great passage about that in your book. If you wouldn't mind, just
Sure,
give us a little excerpt on that. I thought
I have to put on my eyes in order to do
that's
that.
quite all right. I always thought that I thought you summed it up quite well and showed us what we all see on a daily basis here.
Okay, this is from that very first column.
Right.
We're known the world over for the beat of our mojo, for the depth and breadth of our creativity, the warmth of our hospitality, and as the most giving city of our size anywhere. Yet, if you listen to us, you'd never know it. We think it's all about crime, or who the mayor is, was, or isn't, or consolidation, or taxes, or what we'll do about my street, neighborhood, school, Bible, gun. Those are real concerns needing real solutions, but people from everywhere have them. And when we bitch mightily as if they were ours uniquely, we can lose sight of what others see in us. Look at it this way. If everybody sees that funky person you're with as attractive, fun, imaginative, intelligent, capable, different, open, and loaded with potential, and you don't, you're the one who's wrong. As John Cleese purportedly said, if you walk into a room dressed in a suit and everyone else is dressed as a chicken, you're the one who's out of place. Rufus Thomas would have understood.
That sums it up pretty well. Do you find that people who actually come from other places other than Memphis are sometimes even more of a cheerleader for this?
Absolutely.
Now? Yeah.
Absolutely. Back to what I was saying earlier. Now, of course, just like my column is an opinion piece, this is merely my opinion, but yes, they do. And I think they do because they see so much about Memphis that's just fun to note or interesting to note or different to note, that there's not a uniformity to everything here that so many cities have, that there's not a compelling oneness that compels everybody to be just like everybody else. There's a whole lot of difference, and they see that and they celebrate it. We, on the other hand, are so used to it, it becomes commonplace, and we don't realize that we are as interesting as we are, and that other places are not.
That's true. And I've been in this town for not as long as yourself, but I've been in this town for almost 10 years. And I do find that I am pretty much of a cheerleader, you know, and you always wonder about that attitude sometimes that comes across some Memphians, but I find a lot of Memphians are snapping out of that. They're getting with their you know, they're starting to see the positive points of the city and the area.
I see that as well.
Yeah, yeah. Some of the things. Your book, and I mean this as a total compliment, it's the literary equivalent of potato chips in the sense that you cannot just read one of the stories in the book. You find yourself just going through different stories, and one of the stories that was brought up that I thought was a great column was your column about Halliburton. You know,
Richard Halliburton.
Yeah, Richard Halliburton, who I think not some Memphians know about, but
not enough.
Not enough. What an extraordinary life this man had.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He was the real Indiana Jones. I mean, he did those things. He was an amazing individual, and he sort of embodies a lot of what we're talking about in Memphis because people don't know he even existed, and in his day he was one of the 2 or 3 most read authors out there in terms of his romantic stories about his adventures around the world. And of course, he grew up here, went to Princeton, didn't settle here, but did grow up here as a product of the city. And the bell tower on the Rhodes campus is the Halliburton Tower, given by his family in his memory. Even the way he died was the way he lived. He went down in a Chinese junk in 1939 and was never heard of again, just like his good friend Amelia Earhart. So he was an interesting guy.
Fascinating story. You have a line at the end of that column that I thought was apt, and you probably have to finish it for me. But you say something effective. We have to recognize our shooting stars.
That's right.
Or what was the?
Well, I can't remember exactly what I said, but that was it.
Or will be exposed just to the ordinary light of day.
That's right. If we don't recognize our shooting stars, we'll be left with the ordinary light of day.
Yeah. Well, you've had a chance to see your fair share of some of the shooting stars around here.
If you grow up in Memphis and you're an English major or anything like it, you have to have both an Elvis story and a Faulkner story, and I have both of those. Elvis' story was that I pulled up at the light at Union and Cooper one day in my mother's convertible with the top down when a great big Harley pulled up next to me, and I glanced to my right, and there was Elvis sitting on that Harley looking directly at me. And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and he said, "Nice car." And it was a nice car, but that was Elvis. And as I said in a column about that that's in the book, that if the guy behind me hadn't honked his horn, I might still be sitting at that light, because I just was flabbergasted by that. But by the same token, that's kind of the Memphis story. I mean, I did meet and got to know Isaac Hayes, and I didn't talk to Isaac Hayes about the things that people think you would talk to him about. I talked to him about bathroom renovation and fireplace renewal and fixing and various other things we were confronted with jointly while we were sitting in a green room one day for an hour and a half, and got to know him and did some other things with him later on. And people like Kerry Middlecoff, I don't know how many viewers will even remember Kerry Middlecoff, but he was a Memphian and one of the world's greatest golfers in the Golf Hall of Fame, and retired fairly early and lived the rest of his life in Memphis, but in East Memphis, where I was living. And I was out in the front yard one day fooling around with a wedge when I was 13 or 14, and Middlecoff was walking by, just taking a walk, and he stopped and walked over and spent 30 minutes with me, showing me how to hit down on a wedge and how to pinpoint things with a wedge and so on. I mean, Kerry Middlecoff, just on the street. And that was a fascinating thing for me. Those kinds of things shape your feeling about your city, and then you realize that doesn't happen to everybody.
Yeah.
But it happens to an extraordinary number of Memphians because of who's around them. Mm-hmm. The people of Stax and just the music.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and what's in the groundwater here. I mean,
Right.
It's just amazing.
Exactly. I mean, especially in that Macklemore
Oh,
area.
absolutely.
I mean, it's incredible with Maurice White
Oh,
and Al
absolutely,
Green and
yeah.
and things like that.
Yeah.
You also have some. You also talk about the interesting quirks in and nuances related to Memphis history. I was fascinated to read about the Sultana. And some of the links that you made on that. Share those with us a little bit.
Well, first of all, let me give some credit where some credit is due. There is a Memphian, a quintessential Memphian named Jimmy Ogle, that your viewers may know something about. Jimmy's forgotten more about Memphis history than the rest of us will ever know by the time he goes to bed tonight.
Yeah.
And Jimmy knew that I wrote this column, and he called me up one day and he said, "Let's take a drive." Mm-hmm. And I drove, but he led the way. And we went across the river into Arkansas, and we took a drive across what used to be a river, through a field that used to be a river. And I'd lived here all my life, and until Jimmy pointed out to me, I never realized the river used to swing up into Arkansas, and that Mound City, which is now a dusty little spot up there somewhere, and Marion, Arkansas were both river ports. They were on the water. They're not anymore. The river has changed its course that much. But off of Marion, Arkansas, off of actually Mound City, in 1865, the Sultana blew up. The boiler on the steamboat, the Sultana, blew up, and it lost all aboard, including all the animals and horses, and is the greatest maritime disaster in the history of the United States. More lives were lost than the Titanic, and it was much more spectacular and much more tragic because it was carrying with a capacity of, I forget exactly what it was, but something like 15 times its capacity. It was carrying, it maybe had a capacity of 200 and something, it was carrying 1,800 or something, and most of the people it was carrying were prisoners of war just released from the horror that was Andersonville, and they were going home. They were going home from that to the north, and because they were anxious to get there, they were overloaded on that steamboat, and it blew up and they were lost. 8 miles from Memphis, where the explosion certainly could be heard and the fire could be seen from Memphis. And it went down. And they didn't even get headlines regionally, much less nationally, because the day before it went down, John Wilkes Booth was shot in a barn, and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and his assassin was the headlines across the country. And so that story, just like the Sultana, sank. And it needs to be remembered, and we need to bring it up. And there are people over there in Arkansas trying to do that. And that was kind of what Jimmy wanted me to know, and that's why I wrote about it, and I think it's fascinating. I just really do. There's a monument to the Sultana in Elmwood Cemetery, and there's a monument in Marion, Arkansas as well, but there hopefully will soon be a museum that's rising over there. We hope so.
Just a fascinating story. Yeah, it's just amazing.
By the way, the wreck of the Sultana is about 45 feet under a farmer's field over there and could be discovered.
You know, and that also reminds me, you know, the naval battle of 1862 that occurred, you know, where
Our
everybody...
20 uncomfortable minutes.
Yeah, that's right. And basically the wreckage of those boats are located, they believe, in that field just across the city in Arkansas, because the nature of that river has changed so much.
Sure.
Let's switch over a little bit. You tell us in your columns about people that we may not have known, but should have known about. And one of the people that I was impressed with was Burnell Smith.
Absolutely.
Give me an idea of who Burnell Smith was for those out there who don't know.
Burnell Smith was one of those people that everybody becomes fortunate enough to know if they've known, and that everybody needs to know, certainly in the city. He worked a lifetime with the Boys and Girls Clubs of Memphis, first with just the Boys Clubs and then with the Boys and Girls Clubs of Memphis. After it became that and Boys and Girls were both there, he spent 40-something years as just a linchpin in so many people's lives and didn't want any credit for that. He was just there. And some of the more famous people that ever lived here that came through those clubs would come back to speak to kids simply because Burnell asked them to, and stayed involved in their lives. If you don't mind, I'll read something about that.
Yes, I'd love that.
He was a special guy, and I was special enough to have known. It was a special experience for me to have known him.
I was really struck by the passage that you're about to read, because I think it really gave a nice summation of the man if you've never known him.
Thanks. I met him when we were both young men. He looked at me and said, like he had said and would say to thousands, "Come over here. Let me show you how we do this." Then he taught me how to make hobo stew. Over the next 4 decades, he would teach me about selflessness and commitment. He would show me how to see the promise in a kid's eyes the first time he saw a sky full of stars over a lake, the first time she saw her name on an award. He would do that not by lecturing or drawing attention to himself, but, just like that hobo stew, by example. When Burnell Smith was there, it was never about him, and he was always there. Special guy.
Just great. Andy Holt, tell me about him.
Now, I don't know how many of the viewers even remember Andy Holt, but Andy Holt was president of the University of Tennessee. Andy Holt was first and foremost just a good old boy from Milan, but he was also a Columbia PhD and one of the foremost educators of his time. But that never stood out. He was just Andy. And I was fortunate enough to be at the University of Tennessee at the end of his presidency when he was up there. During his reign, the university integrated. He started the Space Institute. He tripled the student population on campus and across the state. But you'd never know any of that by just knowing him. And there's a story in here about him, because before there were computers, before there was anything to really keep up with everybody, there were still 25,000 students on that campus. But somehow, if Andy Holt knew your family, he would find you on that campus before you got out of there and spend some personal time with you, and you didn't know that. And I was one of those examples. I didn't know that he knew my family. But he called at dawn one Sunday morning in a fraternity house, and they come wrestle me out of my room, and I get on the phone, and he tells me it's Andy Holt. I won't tell you what I said to him because I didn't believe him. But he then quickly convinced me that's who it was, and he told me we were going fishing, and I didn't have a choice. And he would pick me up in 15 minutes. And he came by there, picked me up, and took me fishing. And I'll never forget it for as long as I live. It was just Andy and me on a bank catching a zillion brim and listening to his stories, and it was a wonderful thing. And then, more amazing than that even, when he dropped me back off, we had a cooler full of brim. He got out of that car, brought it into that fraternity house. We woke everybody up. We went into the kitchen. He taught the 20 or so zombies I was able to raise how to clean fish and told us all those stories. And to this day, every one of those guys gives to the university, and we'll never forget that. And because Andy Holt was such a me-to-you guy. And I just think that's remarkable, what he used to do and the personality he used to have with all those students and the memories they have of him. So I wrote about that.
Yeah, and that's what makes this book so much fun, because you're sitting there saying, well, I should have known these people. You know, I should have had the opportunity, that moment in time, to have met these extraordinary people. And it's not just about people; it's about places also.
Absolutely. That's what Memphis is about.
Right, right. One that you describe is in a particular chapter is Paradise Found. Set that up for us.
It's Club Paradise.
Club Paradise, right.
On Georgia. Club Paradise was a African American music hall, and it was a place that, growing up in East Memphis, I'd only heard about and could only imagine. That was in a time when the city of Memphis was actually two cities, one black, one white, and they didn't cross paths that often. And Club Paradise was an adventurous sort of place to even think about. But when Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters appeared there, some friends and I decided we need to go. So we did, which entailed stealing their parents', these were two brothers, stealing their parents' mother's station wagon, and trying to find Club Paradise, and we did. And we walked in, and we paid our cover. We were 14 and 15 and almost 16, three of us, and had an incredible night, and were adopted by everybody there. And it was just it was a magic experience, and it made you think that even now, and that was 50 years ago, even now, that all things are possible.
And you have an excerpt that kind of summarizes the feeling of that whole experience.
Yeah, let me just read this a little bit.
Okay.
Way down there, down where we'd never been, in the middle of where we weren't supposed to go, everything was different and the same. Our lives were in different worlds, our futures sharing common ground, completely independent of each other and utterly dependent. Sometimes it seemed we lived then and live now in parallel dimensions. There is real magic when nights like that occur, when we are bound by laughter, by music, by what we share, rather than by what we fear. And I'll continue. We got home, got the car back in the garage as if nothing had changed, but for at least one night, everything had, and it seemed everything could.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It was special.
Yeah.
You know, you said something as if I'm unusual because I've met these people, and I'm unusual because I've had these experiences. What I try to write about is I'm not unusual at all in this town. Everybody in this town has stories. And if they concentrate only on their problems of the moment or what they perceive the future to be, they're going to forget the wonderful lives they've already had and the people they've met and the stories they can share and do share commonly. And we should pay a lot of attention to that, to what we can be based on what we have been and what we need to change to make us better, but to always remember where we came from and to always set a path for where we're going. Stories do that, and I'm not any more unusual than anybody else. I just happen to write about it, but other people need to think about it and then share that, I think.
There's some great, you're right, great storytellers in this town.
Absolutely.
If you know where to look, and there are also some great storytellers that I missed. Just by a very short period coming to Memphis when I did. One of them was Shelby Foote.
Absolutely.
Just wonderful. You know, Willie Bearden tells a story of Shelby Foote going over and seeing Shelby Foote, and he's sitting on the bed with his wife in the afternoon, and he watched a soap opera every afternoon. And he would turn to Willie and he would say, "Excuse me, we're going to watch our story."
Absolutely, that's great. Shelby Foote was great.
Oh, what a great guy.
You know, and a lot of people knew that, but he became famous all over again when he did the Civil War series, when they did that series, and he was on there so often speaking in that wonderful accent of his and telling stories about that. And I remember particularly one thing he said. They had the camera on him and they were moving in on him, and he said, one of the and I'll even try to imitate that accent a little bit because I used to hear it all the time. One of the things that people need to remember is before the Civil War, the United States are
Oh, I see. Yeah.
before the Civil War. Right. After the Civil War, the United States is.
Oh, yeah.
The United States did not become singular in any reference until after the Civil War. And I never thought about that, and that made me realize that before the Civil War, he said in every reference in the writing about the United States was considered a plural.
Oh,
And when the Civil War occurred, and then after the Civil War, the United States was written in the singular as a unit, as a place, not as a separate thing.
Well, Dan Conaway, it's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you.
The book is called I'm a Memphian, and I would recommend it to everybody out there. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.